Next week, isn't it?
Okay.
Once we do that, you'll let us know you're ready. You can start. No changes on it.
I hope so. This is what I wrote up. I think it's correct.
Oh, okay.
Welcome everyone to the next session, which we're calling Bridging the Communications Divide. And what this session about is really going back to TORS and to say the issue for the internet is access to the internet, and it's more than just communications technology. It's a range of issues, and I think many of those issues have been raised in the past 3 days. We're going to revisit them, but we're going to actually start, first of all, with technology. Although, wait a minute, we're going to do something else here. Next slide. Okay. Meaningful connectivity. There are only 2 people, not 3 up here. Daniel couldn't make it in person. Apologies from that. And we're missing Daniel simply because the perspective that he adds is a very interesting one. He's speaking for the First Nations people who have a range of interesting issues, cultural issues, language issues, as well as distant issues. But we're talking about communities that are in the far reaches of this country, difficult to connect, but then with their own additional language and cultural issues. So let me introduce Dr. Paul Brooks. He's Mr. Technology. We're not going to go into all of the qualifications, it's just that he's responsible for communications in Australia. We'll leave it there. Andrew, who is CEO of the ACCAN, the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, the peak body for consumer advocacy for telecommunications. So he's across a range of issues that are between individuals and connectivity to the internet. Myself, Policy Chair of Internet Australia. When I saw this chart, and you can breeze through it, have a look, I thought, oh, well, it's all summed here. And then I have a second look at it and realize there are probably more issues raised by this chart than answered. If you look at the top line, it's Australia, and we look pretty good. In terms of internet users, we're close to 96%, but what that doesn't tell you is that's actually 95.5% of people for 35% of this country. That's a lot of empty space, and that's a lot of places where there isn't the internet. You look at homes connected, that's down to 88%, and that's actually dropping. If you look at the latest statistics from our own regulator, the Communications Media Authority, you realize those figures are dropping. Perhaps the most interesting of the indicators are mobile. And sadly, that's the most important one, because nationally as well as internationally, people are using mobile phones. They are not using home connections. Home connections are dropping even in Australia. Certainly in the world, people have mobile phones before they have home phones, and sometimes before they have homes. So that doesn't tell us very much. We're looking at high-speed broadband. What Paul's going to say is we don't need it anymore. And he's going to explain why he says that. Fixed broadband, the cost, it's almost becoming irrelevant because people, as I say, are looking for mobile broadband. There are some interesting statistics too, and these are forward-looking. I'm looking at the internet users in primary schools. To me, the most interesting statistic wasn't Australia, it was the Cook Islands. 100% of users in primary and secondary, which says the kids are using in a way that is not true in some of the other countries. So if you look at this chart, it can tell you about the divergence of facilities of access, but it can also tell you about the trends. But as I say, perhaps the most important thing it can't tell you is about mobile ownership and mobile access, which are perhaps some of the most important statistics. And there's one statistic that just isn't there at all. This is a cartoon that Paul provided to me. I'll just read it if you can. This is, let's just say, a middle-aged lady going up to the information hub saying, okay, one more time, go home, log on to our website from your computer, create an account, purchase your ticket with your credit or debit card, download the ticket to a smartphone, then come back at the allocated time. Just part of what easier and more convenient don't you get? That's a way of saying that increasingly schools, governments, private enterprise is relying on us and our access to the internet. And it's not always easy. One of these sessions very early in the first day was talking about coding and the fact that increasingly people are using the internet and our alleged access to it to provide us with services that are impossible to access. And if you're talking about bridging the connectivity, One of the most important things is coming up with systems that work for everyone. Now you can talk about your mum accessing the bank, but there are many, many stories about systems that are supposed to work that rely on us to make them work, and they don't. And that's just part of the connectivity story. But we're going to start with Paul. This is something that came out of UN study. It was looking at connectivity and indicating that connectivity is more than just access to a transmission. It's all of the issues involved in access. Yes, it's about infrastructure, but it's also about things like cost of the service, cost of the equipment. It's about the device itself. Is it usable? Can you buy it somewhere? Does it work for you? Does it work for you if you have a disability? Or is that actually shutting you off for connectivity? Do you have the skills? And increasingly, a lot of people don't have the skills. So the transmission system is there, the skills aren't, and you're cut off. And I suppose the last and the thing that's become front of mind for so many people, security and safety. And it's part of the reason that people are not going to be using the internet, that it's now scary and it's not safe. So the first issue that Paul will cover is actually getting the connectivity, the transmission. But then Andrew's next job is to ask the harder questions.
Thank you, Holly. So yes, my name is Paul Brooks. I've been building telecommunications networks for far too many years than I care to admit to. My elevator pitch is that I build the internet, and people talk to me and say, what, just by yourself? So of course not. But I've been involved in projects designing and building and laying submarine cables around the Pacific Islands area. Currently working with the United Nations on trying to get up a Pacific Islands internet exchange for all of the Pacific Islands area. I've worked on satellite networks. I've worked on very large scale terrestrial broadband networks. So the connectivity is the thing. And my policy role and my work with Internet Australia and ISOC, for the last couple of decades, we've been trying to bridge the digital divide by getting people who are not connected and getting some infrastructure there so that they can connect. Increasingly, though, that problem is solved. And the problems, the way that we've solved them in Australia, many of them are actually similar to the challenges faced in Pacific Island nations. Some of them are different. But Australia as a great proving ground for many of the models of achieving connectivity due to the vast spaces with nothing in between that has happened to be dirt rather than water, but the challenges are the same for a telecommunications network. So submarine cables, most of the Pacific Island nations are connected by submarine cables. It used to be the goal was to get a cable to every nation. Now every nation has a cable, and then the concerns are reliability and resilience. What happens if that cable goes down? And we saw that with the volcano recently in Samoa, I think it was, which cut the cable for many, many months. So the challenge over the last, say, 5 or 6 years has been funding and connecting a second cable, creating a diverse path. So if one cable breaks, there's another cable, another path for the internet on cable. Most of those islands were previously connected by satellite. Satellite is great because you can connect everywhere, but the latency, the time delays really restricts the types of traffic, the types of communication you can go over it. It also has the unfortunate effect that in most cases, the satellite link goes up and then comes down in the United States. So you have this weird situation where you have a Pacific Island nation of multiple far-flung islands where it's actually easier and higher performance to get from each nation to the United States than it is from each island within the nation. Microwave technology is great for bridging places. on land and over water, but only really if those islands are within 50 to 80 kilometres or so. Any further than that, and the curvature of the Earth. There are real physical challenges, real physics challenges with getting connectivity. So connectivity is a requirement for using the internet, but it's not the only requirement for people to be able to meaningfully use the internet. And until recently, as a telecommunications network designer for connectivity network, satellite was your least favourite option. It's what you used if you couldn't get anything else. But in the last couple of years, I've been working with low Earth orbit satellites. Starlink is the well-known one that most people have. We have it in Australia. Many more countries are starting to get it, starting to get the licensing for it. And it is magic. It is a game changer. If your country does not have it, take it from me. I've been working with it a lot. It has the benefits of satellite in that you can get connectivity anywhere with a satellite dish you can carry in your car, you can carry it in a backpack, you can connect it up to a car battery. Most of the Ukraine war is being run over many thousands of Starlink terminals strapped to the side of the tanks and armoured personnel carriers, because the Russians knocked out all of the communications technology and the internet. A lot of those terminals are powered by car batteries. Learned about this in a talk last year at an Australian internet conference by some very clever people in New Zealand that designed a DC power supply that will run Starlink off that rather than a 240 volt mains power. Anyway, it combines the connect everywhere aspect of satellite, but the latency and the performance of the link is the same as a mobile phone. And I've done the trial of flicking a standard phone handset into airline mode, turn on Wi-Fi calling, it connects to the Wi-Fi of the Starlink, runs over the satellite, connects back in, and makes a mobile phone call to your local carrier with performance that is absolutely indistinguishable from a normal mobile phone call. And it'll do that from the middle of the outback, it'll do that from the middle of the ocean, it'll do that from Zimbabwe to my local phone carrier here in Australia. It is absolutely a game changer. The important thing to understand is that Starlink is only the first constellation, and there's 5,000 satellites out of 12,000 satellites that are potentially in orbit. But there are 3 other low Earth orbit competing constellations from Amazon, from Microsoft, and a couple others I can't even remember, that will be going up over the course of the next 5 years. So that will introduce competition, which will drive the prices down. The main problem with Starlink and a lot of these low Earth orbit satellites coming up is not the technology, it's the cost. About 130 Australian dollars a month to run this thing. But cost is something that can be changed very quickly by a government subsidy, by a voucher system, or by, it turns out, Elon Musk deciding, yeah, they're good people, we'll throw them 100 terminals for free, which is what they did to get Samoa back online after the volcano, to connect all the government departments with a signal coming up and coming back down in Fiji, I believe, because none of the Earth stations in Samoa were going to work. So a disaster recovery platform like nothing on Earth. Technology in Australia, the regional and rural communications divide, Starlink and low Earth orbit fixes it. In Pacific Island nations, where you've got far-flung islands that can't be connected back to the main island locally and are connecting via satellite, Starlink, low Earth orbit satellites fixes that. So the technology aspect of connecting is largely solved. Now it's time to move on to the other layers, and that's where our advocacy in Australia is starting to move beyond the getting the unconnected connected, because basically everyone can connect now, to those next order of things: affordability, devices, skills. And the cartoon was prompted by my mother, who ran into a challenge with her local bank trying to make a payment because the bank changed their authentication system and requires her to download an app on a phone. She doesn't know how to download a phone. She can, an app. She can barely use a mobile phone to make a phone call. But the bank is expecting the users to know or to be able to get help or have someone to advise them for how to set up the authentication mechanism to get a one-time password, an SMS code, something that makes the banking system something that we can use because we're au fait with the technology, but there are people in the community that are not, and our institutions, our banking institutions, our government institutions are making assumptions that just because an online method is available, that they can then shut down all the other methods that somebody who cannot access the online method can't use. And on that note, I'll pass on to Andrew.
No, you won't. Paul, you've mentioned that a country has to sign up to Starlink. So what if you live in a country that hasn't signed up to the satellite?
Okay, so that's generally a regulatory and a licensing issue. Most companies have a telecommunications licensing regime where you need to have a license to be a telecommunications provider. The Starlink system is a telecommunications network. The system goes up and comes back down, generally in the same country. And generally the requirement, and the volcano disaster was an outlier, that means that the Starlink network provider needs to get a license in your country. There are many countries where the system is not licensed. For example, in Papua New Guinea, Starlink is not licensed to operate. The consequence of that is if you put a Starlink on a ship and that ship sails out off the northern tip of Australia towards Papua New Guinea, the moment that ship crosses that dotted line in the middle of the ocean where it becomes PNG national territory, Starlink by legislation switches itself off and the boat no longer has connectivity. It still could communicate, but because under law the system is not allowed to operate in PNG waters, the Starlink network deliberately detects by GPS that the terminal has moved across the boundary and shuts itself off. The same boat navigates from Australia through the Indonesian Sunda Strait and then to Singapore. Indonesia doesn't have Starlink licensed to operate in its territory yet. Singapore does. So the moment that same ship travels out of Australian Indonesian waters through international waters, crosses the dotted line into Indonesian territory in the middle of the ocean, the Starlink system turns off, they get through to the other side, out the dotted line into international waters, it turns back on again. They then have better connectivity than most people in the capital city in Australia. It runs at 300 megabits per second. It's just insane. And then runs all the way through to Singapore. And as they're docking in Singapore, it continues to operate because it's licensed to operate in Singapore. It's a licensing issue. It can be fixed. If you are in a country that does not have Starlink operating, you need to petition your government to allow Starlink to get a telecommunications provider license in your country so that they can operate. Or one of the other networks, the Microsoft network or the Amazon network, Project Kuiper, one of those, and as soon as one gets access, the rest will want access as well. But it's a government licensing issue, and that's how it gets fixed, by not changing the license regime, but encouraging your telecommunications department to allow the Starlink organisation to get a communications provider license in your country.
Thank you, Paul. Andrew.
Thank you. As Hoilly mentioned, my name's Andrew Williams. I'm the Chief Executive of the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, and we're the peak body for communications consumers in Australia. And in a nutshell, we advocate for services that are trusted, inclusive, accessible and available to all Australians. As a side note, in a former life, I was actually I spent many years as a navigator in the Australian Navy, and during that I actually spent quite a bit of time. I've spent quite a bit of time in the Pacific You've only got to sail a ship from Panama to Sydney to know how much water there is in that ocean. So I've been to a lot of the countries that we've been talking about, and for example, in the previous session we're talking about Niue, Tuvalu. So I've got a pretty good understanding of some of the geographic challenges that go on in the Pacific. But my focus today is really just to follow up probably on the last three lines of Holly's slide, and just give some insights from the Australian perspective. So starting with device availability, because that's a really big issue in Australia. Recently as about 2 months ago, we launched, or Australia launched the Australian Digital Inclusion Index for the updated one for 2023. I think it runs every 2 or 3 years, and it showed that if you're looking at those Australians who are highly digitally excluded, or even just digitally excluded, we're talking about nearly 25% of the population who really don't have adequate access to the internet, and also access to utilise the internet to its full capability. So, and devices are a big part of that, because even as I think one of the interesting points from the previous session was that it's very similar in Australia, and in a lot of the Pacific countries, mobile devices are the predominant means of accessing the internet, and to have a fully digitally included economy, mobile devices don't provide the full utility that's needed, and that there's only limited capability. It's only generally suited for less complex, quite simple tasks and uses of the internet. Very difficult to work and study online on a mobile device, particularly a mobile phone, and that's something that's really been amplified in Australia over the last 2 to 3 years, obviously, as we've all gone to working, studying, and doing everything online during the pandemic. So that's a big thing, and positively, what we're starting to see is a lot more focus on repurposing devices in Australia, second-hand devices. There's a lot of social purpose and not-for-profit organisations who are trying to focus on repurposing, ideally government devices, when government departments transition their IT, then rather than sending them to landfill or some other way, is just having some better coordination of how we can repurpose them and provide a more affordable option for low-income consumers, because we can really go into the affordability in great detail, but I think Paul's touched on that, and there's obviously environmental benefits to that as well. So the less we're putting into landfill, the more that we're assisting the environment. On a side note, we're also keeping a close eye on some of the legislation in Europe, where they're standardising that USB-C is going to be the standard charging for all devices. So that is going to have a significant impact. Funnily enough, Apple don't see the funny side of that, but I think they'll survive. So that's a big one for us. The other really big one in Australia is digital skills and the ability to utilise the internet to its full capability, and that's an area that is ongoing. We've got a number of organisations working on digital skills particularly for the most vulnerable consumers, and that would include low-income consumers. Senior Australians are really an area where we've got a number of fairly significant programs to try and upskill senior Australians, and as Paul touched on earlier, we've got our remote Indigenous communities. There's probably about 70% of the Australian land mass is in remote areas, and there's a lot of our Indigenous communities that Dr. Daniel Featherston and his work has been focusing over the last few years, where digital skills and access to the internet and devices is prominent. So that's a big one for us, and there's quite a number of programs on that, because obviously the more Australians we get connected and being able to utilise it, the greater economic benefit. And we're also finding that there's a significant number of government and non-government services, as highlighted by Paul's cartoon, are being increasingly driven online. That in itself creates a whole raft of other challenges, because we do acknowledge that there will always be a reasonably significant cohort of Australians who don't want to be online and don't want to be connected. And again, with the previous panel, I think it was the guy was talking about the situation in Niue, for example. Having that paper-based system is to support those who do want to be online is absolutely important as well. So we have flagged that with government and industry, that while it's great that the majority of Australians do want to be connected and do want to access all of the relevant services, whether that's social security, whether that's employment opportunities or anything else, there will always be a significant element who don't or can't or won't want to be engaged in that manner. And the other really important one on that is it is very easy to overlook the cohort, a significant cohort of people with disability, and that's something with the digital skills that's really important. At ACCAN, for the last 3 or 4 years, or 5 years in fact, we've run a program initially supported by government, then supported by industry, and it's now back to being supported by government, to try and provide as much information on the appropriate devices and systems for people with a variety of disabilities. So if you just imagine, with your smartphone, if you are visually impaired, hearing impaired, or have other some other cognitive issue that makes it difficult to utilise it, then what are the products out there that can actually be utilised for your specific situation? Funnily enough, there has actually been very, very little information on that until we started running our program, and it's very manual. There's no automated way for when a Telstra or an Optus upgrades their devices, or whether it's an Apple or a Samsung. There is no automated way to find out what new features are available for specific disabilities. So we have to work through that systematically and update quite manually. The other allied issue related to that is website accessibility as well. We do, and we run a grant program, and one of the grantees a few years ago did a research project on all of the major telecommunications companies' websites, and found that the majority of them were very, very difficult to access and navigate for people with vision impairment. So there's web content accessibility guidelines. It's a UN standard, and we're advocating very strongly for all Australian organisations, not only just the telecommunications companies, but everybody in Australia should be adhering to those guidelines. And before I came to ACCAN, I had no idea it existed, but now it's an integral part of what we do. Even our board papers, because I've got one director who's vision impaired and another one coming on who's hearing impaired. So just reviewing all of our internal systems and processes to make sure that we don't forget those that really important element of or cohort that has a disability. And finally, before I hand back to Hoilly, security and safety. It's no secret, but scams is just insidious. doesn't matter whether you're in Australia, whether you're anywhere else. Scams, we've lost, I think that the latest data in Australia has been over $4 billion has been lost in scams over the last 12 to 18 months, and that number's not likely to go down in a hurry. Coordination across all the different bodies has been a real challenge in Australia, but finally, under our new government that's been in power now for about 18 months, we've finally got an overarching coordinating structure together called the National Anti-Scam Centre, and there's education is a key part of that. There's legislation, there's voluntary codes that the telecommunications companies have implemented that have been successful in blocking hundreds of millions of scam text and mobile phone calls and landline calls. But what we're finding is that that's now pushing a lot of these scams off to some of the other digital platforms, WhatsApp, Messenger, things like that. So having an education and a redress capability action plans across all of the different organisations, whether it's the competition and consumers, whether it's the telcos, the banks are a big part of that as well, because most of the harm comes when people transfer money, and then you've got the blockchain industry as well, because a lot of the scams we're finding are happening over cryptocurrency as well. So that's a real burgeoning issue in Australia, where the National Anti-Scam Centre has been up and running now for probably only about 6 months, but we are really confident that we'll start to see some greater coordination and really make it difficult for the scammers, because if we can disrupt their business model, then that will go a long way to addressing that. But I think it's relevant in this forum too, because we are finding that a lot of the harm and the hurt with scams is again in our most vulnerable cohorts, our Indigenous Australians, our low-income Australians, and probably our seniors as well. So I think that's got some relevance in this forum. In the interest of time, Holly, I think I'll shut up.
Thank you, Andrew. And for information about a lot of the stuff that ACCAN does, it's ACCAN, accan.org.au. I won't give you Paul's address. Any final words before I take questions? Any further comments?
Yeah, I'll just mention one thing that I think is important from a telecommunications perspective, but it's not actually to do with communications. A lot of communications providers get a very bad rap because of concerns about reliability. Most of the reliability issues that we see are generally due to problems with the underlying electricity supply. We saw that in Australia with the severe bushfires a few years ago, where a lot of the inability to communicate, including amongst the emergency services crews themselves, were because the telecommunications infrastructure is inherently relying on the electricity network. Many of the mobile phone towers rely on generators. Generators run out of fuel, and in a bushfire and emergency scenario, you can't get the tankers in there to refuel the generators. They run for 2 or 3 hours after the mains power fails, and then they turn off as well. And what we found is the crews couldn't get in to replenish the generators. Much of the infrastructure didn't have generators. Something like Starlink as a portable system needs power to run. As soon as your phone runs out of batteries, if you haven't got any local electricity, you can't recharge your phone. You can't run your radio. The batteries run out in your transistor radio. If you've still got one of those, tuned to AM, all information stops. So a lot of the resilience and improvements for telecommunications availability and making it more reliable actually comes down to making the electricity more reliable. And I'm pretty sure that Australia isn't the only country where that's true. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Just going back to the theme is actually connectivity. And as the chart, which we've lost now, pointed out, there are many aspects to connectivity. It's not just actually the connection, it's all of the other stuff that gets between you and connecting. And that's what we try to address. And again, ACCAN is part of that. And there are other information that you can access as well. But we've got a little bit of time left. If anybody's got questions, either for Andrew or for Paul about connectivity. And if not, okay. We've answered all your questions. No, we haven't.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. My question comes only on the affordability part, probably because of different markets. But I'm from, by the way, I'm Brian, and I'm from the Solomon Islands. And in 2019, we just have our first submarine cable that landed in 2019, but I think everyone's complaining that affordability has come down as promised. Would there be any reasons as to why from maybe in theory? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm familiar with the cable. That was a cable that was built, in fact, by the organisation that I'm currently working my day job with by Vocus. But yeah, that cable from Solomon Islands comes into Sydney. I suspect there's a number of the reasons for that prices haven't come down as they might have been promised, largely come down to a lack of competition. So there is one cable to Solomon Islands, so the operator of that cable can charge what they like. When you get two cables or three cables, or you get two cables and another method of communicating, such as a high-performing satellite, once you start getting some competitive tension, it's amazing how quickly those wholesale prices come down. But also in the Solomon Islands and your guidance, is there more than one telecommunications provider that you can go to get service? Is there competition amongst the infrastructure providers? Are there multiple organisations who are permitted to dig trenches and put fibre? Or is everybody buying their services, all the internet service providers buying their services wholesale from the same group, often a government-owned group in many of these nations? Different islands, nations have different degrees of competition and different degrees of deregulation in their systems. In Australia, all the telecommunication providers are all private organisations, some listed on a stock exchange. They're not government owned. In some other nations, the telecommunications provider is still the old model where it's a department of a government department. And when there's only one, there's no incentive to reduce prices because that goes straight to reducing their ability to pay generally far too many employees. That's what we saw in Australia with Telstra, Telecom Australia at the time. So I suspect it'll be related to that sort of area. The infrastructure's there, the communication's there, the bandwidth is there. It's a market structure issue that might be holding prices up higher than they might otherwise be.
Any other questions for Paul or Andrew?
Keeping on with the submarine cables, Jonathan Brewer from New Zealand. Aside from the case of the Solomons and the Coral Sea cable network, the rest of the Pacific Islands have cables that they've taken out loans to purchase. Now, they need to charge what they're charging on the cables to pay back their loans. The governments are heavily invested in these cables. They're the ones who owe the money. So they don't have any incentive to allow competition from satellite networks because that would reduce their ability to pay their loans. Any solutions here?
Australia had some of the very same issues, moving from one competitor to many competitors. And let's just say it was a bumpy road. We got there, but some of it wasn't very pretty.
Things are always muddy when it comes to money. Being an engineer is brilliant because you get to dig holes in the ground, throw some conduit, throw some fibre, provide some services, connect people that couldn't get a signal before, and do all sorts of wonderful things, provided the funding is there to buy it, and provided you've got some smart ways of sourcing the components so you're not being charged too much for it. Submarine cables are extremely expensive, as you well know. We're talking, around the Pacific Islands area, a typical submarine cable is in the area of, a short one, 80 million US, a long one, Australia to the US, you're talking 250, 300 million US dollars for a cable. Now, it lasts for 25 to 30 to 35 years. It has almost infinite bandwidth. And as long as you keep upgrading the equipment connected onto the ends of it, then you almost never fill it up. You generally find a cable retires because it's become obsolete based on another cable being run parallel to it than the cable itself stopping working. But if it's funded by debt and it's funded by loans, a lot of those loans are funded by the World Bank and or UN processes, intergovernmental processes. They're not necessarily done in the private market mostly. And when that happens, there are avenues, if someone petitions enough, for the debt to be forgiven and wiped off. That debt and financials and balance sheets and things are funny things where if you have the right accountant and the right financial machinations, you can make amazing things happen with the stroke of a pen. It's actually much easier to do that than to contract a cable laying ship and lay something along the bottom of the ocean for 6 to 12 months, particularly now when most of the cable ships are utilised in other projects. So the only solution I can see for that is to actually get the debt forgiven, or in some countries, it's an election process where the population speaks to the popularity of a government that doesn't allow competition, and the government finds itself getting voted out of office for things like not being able to provide communications infrastructure where the population thinks they need it, along with things like not providing banking infrastructure where the population thinks it, or basic healthcare. Telecommunications is as important, connection to the internet is as important as good health, clean running water, good education, and a government that can't provide comparably low costs in all of those things compared to comparable nations is likely to find itself on the wrong end of the population's ire, and the more that happens, the better.
I'm not sure that answered your question. Is it something you would like to talk about offline? But it's a very real issue.
Thank you. The answer of debt forgiveness is probably the best answer.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? If not, I'd like to say thank you to Andrew and thank you to Paul. And I'm sure both of them will be available maybe over coffee for 10 minutes. But thank you all.
Hello, it's me again. Please do remember to put all of the highlight discussions and topics from this session into our platform comment.aprigf.asia. Up next in the same room after the tea break, you can go and grab some coffee and some tea. It'll start at 11:30. It is Connecting Communities, Community Radio for Connectivity, Inclusion, Digital Rights, and Freedom of Expression. So please get some refreshments and come back into the room starting at 11:30. Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Sorry.
Yes.
Take some pictures of the panel and I'll keep it on. If you want it right away, I can send it to you.
Yeah, that'd be great. If you could, Holly can forward it through to us. There you go. That'd be great. Or can you send one to me? My media guy on my back. Oh, excellent. Yeah. Email's perfect. Yeah.
I don't have a media guy, but if you can send it through, that'd be great.
Are we back on stage?
No, she said she did take some while we were talking.
Oh, good. Perfect.
Yes, they're all taken already.
Perfect.